Welcome to the Marc and Mike Show. I am Mark DeLucchi. He is Michael Lee, talking sports. Well, we'll presumably be talking sports, at least in the short term. This is our second episode. You want to check out our first episode on the YouTube channel or on our SoundCloud. You can follow the show on our various social medias. That's Instagram and Twitter. That's at Marc and Mike Show. Mark with a C. Don't get caught up in that. Mark with a K Jazz or anything like that. You can follow us personally. You can follow me at Mad Delucchi. That's MADDELUCCHI. You can follow him at ME Lee on Twitter. Is it at ME Lee on Twitter and at
ME Lee _808 on Instagram.
_808, giving Hawaii a shout out as always. So if you missed our first episode, we talked a bit about COVID-19. Well, a lot about COVID-19, but we got to sports eventually, talked about its impact there. We really though focused on the UFC because they're the one sport that has insisted on continuing play, even while very likely putting fighters and other people at risk. We also talked about them because Jon Jones, one of their most prominent celebrity fighters, was arrested in along lines of let's say off the octagon affairs. He has a long list, a little rap sheet. We have a little update on that. He pled guilty to the DWI. So, Michael, you want to give sort of the rundown and your take on the newest news there?
Yeah, so today TMZ reported, today is Tuesday, March 31st, that Jon Jones struck a deal with prosecutors, which will allow him to avoid jail time. But instead, Jones will receive 96 hours of community custody, which is essentially house arrest, which when you think about it is what we should be doing anyway during this time. And then he's also going to get 1 year supervised probation and a minimum 90 days of outpatient therapy, which will be conducted through video due to the COVID crisis. So basically, Jones avoids jail time, which is probably the biggest thing for him personally. I don't see this necessarily precluding him from fighting in the UFC whenever the UFC decides. I mean, they are trying to run, but whenever action really starts to pick up again, I don't imagine Jon fighting anytime, even if they have a show plan soon, because he just fought in February. But basically, if you're Jon Jones, this is probably best case scenario. He pretty much gets out without much. He's going to have 1 year probation. And he also issued a statement saying that he acknowledges basically that he has some personal work to do, which involves the unhealthy relationship he has with alcohol. That's what his press release said today from his management. And he also apologized to people about how disappointing this is, and another negative headline, basically. So I guess he's trying to say all the right things, but the question isn't whether he's going to say all the right things. It's, will he actually do the right thing? Is he going to take this therapy seriously? Obviously, he has 90 days of state-mandated therapy. Will he do more beyond that? Because that probably cannot hurt Jon in the long run. And also, too, I mean, a lot of people will wait to see what the UFC says or does about it. I personally don't anticipate the UFC doing much of anything about this.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because you mentioned sort of last time, again, I'm not as well in touch with the UFC, but sort of that the jail time is a big issue. If he'd gotten jail time, that would have caused the UFC to react. Is there a reason really they have explained to sort of what makes that distinction for them? Or is that just something sort of how they've acted in the past?
The UFC is always notoriously vague when it comes to these kind of things. Even though they do have a fighter code of conduct, they're pretty lax with it. I mean, if there was ever an opportunity to really punish a fighter, it was when Conor McGregor threw the dolly at the bus. He got arrested in Brooklyn, New York a few years ago, but they ended up doing absolutely nothing about it, and in fact used the footage as promotional material for the fight, and which obviously built up the UFC 229 is the biggest pay-per-view in UFC history with over 2.4 million buys. I don't really see there's not really a clear guideline on how the UFC would approach something like this, so I highly doubt that Jon will get any punishment from the UFC's end. They might try to recommend therapy to him. That's the max I personally see coming from this.
Interesting. So what else is going on around sports, Mike?
Yeah, so there's actually surprisingly been a lot. One of the big stories coming out yesterday was that the NCAA gave an eligibility extension to every athlete, including and also increase the scholarship cap limit that will be allowed. Now, it's up to the schools to decide exactly how they want to deal with this, because obviously there's concerns about some mid-major and low-major schools might not be able to afford this kind of thing. But the NCAA is essentially leaving the door open for an eligibility extension for all athletes. And also another thing is, that athletes are going to have to consider, for example, baseball players, is do they want to enter the draft instead, but also the draft might be shorter this year. We'll probably have a larger episode about this in the future, but the main story is that the NCAA allowed for an eligibility extension. In other news, the NBA is doing a 16-man 2K tournament, the video game, and which each team will have a representative, including Kevin Durant, I think, is going to represent the Brooklyn Nets in this. And they're going to have a 2K tournament airing on the ESPN networks this coming weekend, I believe. In other news, the NFL, they expanded their playoffs to add one more team each in each conference, and now it'll be seeded mainly on overall record instead of divisions. So that's a big change, obviously. And in addition to that, they also announced that one playoff game from each conference, this additional wildcard game essentially, will be televised in addition to CBS and Fox or whatever their TV network it is also going to have a simulcast of Nickelodeon to allow for to target a younger audience for that. In other news, as Marc could probably give you more details about it, the commissioner's office finally agreed to pay minor league players, as Marc might have more details about here.
Yeah, I mean, I can kind of give the rundown. I think this ties in with the NCAA eligibility, because one of the things about, you mentioned the draft. Well, the thing is, the draft has been condensed. The players and the players union, we'll get into the details and nuances of it, in another episode where that's the main story, which is not what we're going to do today. But long story short, it's been condensed from 40 rounds to 5 rounds. And signing bonuses, there's basically not going to be as much flexibility, which means less players are probably going to have the advantages, have the ability to take advantage of the draft. And so more guys are probably going to want to come back than usual, which is a problem for schools for multiple reasons. One is, as you mentioned, there's the scholarship issue where obviously now the good thing, and it's the right thing to do, the NCAA has said, if you're going to lose a scholarship, you were planning for a senior to graduate and then use that scholarship on a recruit, that senior's not going to count against your cap. But let's say you're a school like Vanderbilt, a top D1 program. Well, you might have been going with the assumption you had juniors who were going to get drafted, and then those scholarships would be available for recruits. Now that guy might not sign. Now he might be coming back an extra year, because while seniors are the only ones who, if they come back, won't count against the scholarship number, everyone got an extra year of eligibility. So if you were a first year this year on the baseball team, you still have your 4 years of eligibility remaining, which could create a little backlog down the road. Again, I don't necessarily disagree with what the NCAA did here, but this is a case where there were some teams, including multiple Power 5 teams, credit to Kendall Rogers at D1 Baseball, who did this reporting, that didn't want this. And they go, it wasn't, they didn't wish this upon the players, but just the reality of now there's high school guys who are going to get blocked in, issues with playing time there. And so with the minor leaguers, though, MLB's paying them $400 a week. It's a flat pay scale, meaning if you were signed to a minor league contract, you're going to be in the minor leagues this year, you're getting $400 a week for the extended period of time that baseball is basically agreed upon at the moment. For lower level minor leaguers, that's actually probably more than they would have made. We can talk at length about how minor leaguers don't even make minimum wage and a lot of other problems with baseball. But so actually lower level minor leaguers are probably pretty happy right now, because that's about what they would have made, if not more than what they would have made. However, veteran minor leaguers, guys who were free agents and signed minor league free agent contracts, those guys are generally getting closer to $2,000 to $3,000 a week at the high end of that. So those guys are really suffering some consequences here. Obviously, $400 is better than nothing, but the flat pay scale, right, the people at the top of that are going to be upset by it. The people at the bottom, though, do benefit.
Yeah, and then the final piece of news, we'll talk more about this in a future episode, but a final piece of news is that Dallas Wings center in the WNBA, Imani McGee-Stafford, has decided to step away from the next 2 seasons from the WNBA to pursue a law degree from Southwestern Law School in Los Angeles. If you don't follow the WNBA, she's the sister of NBA player and Lakers center JaVale McGee. She's kind of been an emerging force in the WNBA. She's averaged in her career 10.8 points, 8.2 rebounds, and 2.1 blocks per game. She's only 25 years old, but she's decided, especially with the uncertainty going on, to try to take this time to pursue a law degree.
And this isn't the first time we've seen a WNBA star of this caliber take some time away from the game.
Maya Moore just did it.
Stepped away. I was going to say to do some criminal justice activism with some amazing work. Candace Parker has taken some breaks over her career. We've seen players venture, into other realms. Again, one other thing we'll talk about, right? One thing that is exciting is that the WNBA draft is actually going to be in 16 days, which for the WNBA means they're for once going to, at least let's put it this way, they should, and I think very much will, get coverage that they never get because, again, we're going to be there's just not going to be a lot of sports out there. Well, it looks like the WNBA draft is going to happen in 16 days. Obviously, it won't be an in-person event, but still news and coverage. Again, Michael and I are going to start diving into that pretty soon, so we can start doing our rankings, talking about these teams, and maybe even putting out some mock drafts. Which is, again, key for exposure because part of the reason these players have to step away is while NBA players, many of them are dealing with, thinking financially long-term, they're still making, at minimum 500,000, maybe even $1 million, 1.5 million a year. And so, they're willing to stick it out in the NBA. The WNBA does not have that. And part of that is a function of revenue, but part of that's also the league executives not doing a good job about giving them the exposure. It's about league executives and media bias and player equity. WNBA players get a smaller percentage of their revenue than NBA players do. I think, again, it's something we see in, whether it's women's soccer compared, with when we're talking about the U.S. men's team and women's team in compensation. And it's, again, happening here. And we see the consequence of this is that the league is losing a face of a franchise, a young budding star. And again, good for her. And, for her to be, doing this for herself. But this is something that probably is much less likely to happen if there is pay equity in the WNBA.
I think one interesting thing to track with this WNBA draft is what's the Sabrina Ionescu effect going to be on this draft? She's become one of the greatest college basketball players, male or female, of like however long college basketball has existed. She's been getting a lot of media exposure on ESPN. She was a really good friend of Kobe Bryant, who recently passed, and she even spoke at had his celebration of life at the Staples Center. So it'd be kind of interesting to see how all this additional media attention on Ionescu will translate to the WNBA draft, because I don't think it's been a very long time, maybe not since like a Brittany Griner or Breanna Stewart or something, where we saw this much attention being paid on a women's player coming from the college ranks up to the WNBA. And you could almost argue that Ionescu is already the most popular women's basketball player, pro or amateur, in the world right now.
And again, that's where it's going to be incumbent on the league and also the media to try and build off of the momentum she has. Because one of the things, too, we see this again throughout athletics. When we talk about at the collegiate level, women's sports is quite popular, often as popular as men's athletics. When then it goes to the professional levels where there's less exposure, less news coverage, and the teams maybe are less established, so the fan bases aren't as intense, that's where interest starts to wane. Now, again, there's more people starting to hold these leagues accountable, starting to hold media and news outlets accountable for not covering these leagues as much. But again, hopefully she can sort of be a transitional point into growing the WNBA into the next step. Because one thing, too, obviously the WNBA and NBA are in a partnership. The NBA saw ratings decline this past year. The WNBA actually saw an increase in ratings in the same amount of time. The NBA is, trying to sort of counteract is, the NFL has kind of been the only sport that hasn't been seeing some TV declines over the past few years in viewership. You wonder if bringing in, again, using the WNBA as an avenue to bring in other fan bases from new cities and new environments could be a way to grow the game of basketball as well.
Yeah, we'll definitely talk more about the WNBA draft as we get closer. We'll probably have an episode dedicated to previewing the draft. But for now, we want to move on because we're trying to keep this episode shorter for you guys so we don't lose your attention span quicker. So today we're going to do something that's been in the news recently, NFL free agency. And we're going to start our division by division roundup by starting with the division that's honestly made the most noise this offseason, the NFC South. So for those of you who don't know, the 4 teams in the NFC South are New Orleans Saints, the Carolina Panthers, Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and the Atlanta Falcons. And last year in 2019, it was pretty much a runaway win for the New Orleans Saints, led by Drew Brees, finished with a record of 13-3. If not for a late season stumble, probably were the favorites to make the NFC Championship game, but ended up losing to Minnesota in the wild card round. And then they were followed by a tie between the Atlanta Falcons and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers at 7-9. Many people point out Tampa Bay was led by Jameis Winston through a historic season for partly the wrong reasons, because he threw a record number of both touchdowns and interceptions.
Good and bad. 5,000 yards.
Yeah, and he also his team lost a lot of games by one possession. So that was kind of one thing. A lot of people are saying that their record last year should have been better than it ended up being. And then at the bottom, you have the Carolina Panthers, who dealt with the injury of Cam Newton the entire year, never really gave him a chance to play. Kyle Allen was their starter, and it was really Christian McCaffrey show for most of the season for the Carolina Panthers. A lot of activity happening in this division. Obviously, if you follow sports, the biggest news of ever since the COVID-19 outbreak in sports has been Tom Brady deciding to leave the New England Patriots after, I believe it was 19 seasons, 6 Super Bowls, and has decided to join the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Who would have thought coming into this that it would be Tampa would be his,
very arguably the worst franchise in professional sports history.
Yeah, definitely. That's definitely not an overstatement there. And in other news, in terms of free agency, the New Orleans Saints, they re-signed their veteran quarterback, Drew Brees, to a two-year, $50 million deal. There was a leak today from Sean Payton, who might have revealed that this is Drew Brees' last season and therefore the last chance to win another Super Bowl. He won one about 10 years ago now, I'd say. They also signed Malcolm Jenkins, Emmanuel Sanders from your 49ers. And then, but another big move for the Saints was that they lost Teddy Bridgewater to free agency to the Carolina Panthers. What's your take on that?
Yeah, so, the thing about the Panthers is they're kind of in this in-between, right? They, move on from Ron Rivera, who's now in Washington, and hire Matt Rule from Baylor. And Rule's, got a 6-year contract, got plenty of security, and they aren't a very talented team. I understand why they move on from Cam Newton. It makes no sense to cut Cam Newton in a vacuum, but it sounds like Newton said he wanted an extension or he wanted to be released, and so they decided to grant him his release. And so going with Bridgewater, he's a perfect stopgap. I think I do think he's probably someone who ranks from that 17 to 25 range in terms of quarterbacks in the league, where he's a low-tier starter. Ideally, you just want him to be a really good backup you have, and I think he showed that with the Saints, right? He plugged into an elite team, right, with New Orleans, was very good to start the season. And when Drew Brees came back, obviously the Saints went 13-3. And again, the Saints, right, they weren't going to be able to pay Bridgewater $20 million and Brees $25. That's sort of the salary cap conundrum they had. They made what probably is the right decision, sticking with Brees. At the same time, it's just inevitably, you will probably hold on to that quarterback for too long. And I am not a Taysom Hill believer. I think Taysom Hill is a good weapon. I think you can use him in a lot of cool packages and flexibilities. But the fact is, he is not young. And he hasn't really been very impressive as a passer. He is not someone I see as a long-time quarterback unless you are really coming up with an innovative new offense we haven't seen before, because he isn't the caliber of athlete of Lamar Jackson. I've heard some people throw out there that Sean Payton is just trying to sort of slowly transition the offense from a new pro style with Drew Brees to kind of the new running quarterback thing around Lamar, like the Baltimore did last year around Lamar Jackson. Hill isn't that caliber of athlete. He's a very good athlete. He's a very good passer, but not elite at either of them, and not to the caliber to me to carry a team. And so New Orleans is long-term plan. I'm curious to see what they do. Curious to see, they're picking at 24. They don't have a second-round pick, but they have the rest of their draft picks. I wouldn't be shocked if we see them taking a quarterback relatively high. At 24, I don't see them making a move way up. Maybe Jordan Love, although, we'll see about that. But kind of, I like Malcolm Jenkins. I like Emmanuel Sanders, and I like them I like them as fits on the team. They're good players. Same with Drew Brees. But again, they're older guys. All of them have injury histories, and you just worry that you're putting sort of a lot of eggs in this basket. I do like what they did with Malcolm Jenkins. They also signed DJ Swearinger, who has a pretty good history on a veteran minimum deal. That's a good insurance policy to have on Jenkins. Sanders, I like the value. 2 years, $16 million. He was a very good receiver with the 49ers. He really transformed that offense once he arrived. Deebo Samuel got a lot of highlights if you were watching those games. Deebo Samuel, I think, is going to be a monster in this league, but he really wasn't unlocked until he had Emmanuel Sanders outside on the other side of the field to give Kyle Shanahan sort of that second wideout weapon alongside Samuel, and obviously with George Kittle at tight end. The good thing for the Saints, though, is, again, as I mentioned, you have your first-round pick that's at 24. You know, you're disappointed you lost to the Vikings in the divisional round. They should have been in the conference championship game, probably trying to go up against the 49ers. I mean, you could see it when the Niners were just running all over the Vikings, right? The Vikings were not the second-best team in the NFC, but they got the better of New Orleans when it mattered most. New Orleans doesn't really have a huge team need, though. It's really about depth pieces. It's depth at cornerback, it's depth at quarterback, and it's depth at receiver. And again, they've kind of addressed all those issues in some ways, right? Bringing in Jenkins for the secondary, bringing in Sanders for the wideouts, and obviously bringing back Breeze. But it's just about making sure you have some insurance policies. They could probably maybe use a bit of help on the interior of the defensive line, maybe a bit at linebacker. But again, I mean, really, this is probably pound for pound the most talented team in football if you ignore the quarterback position. I think the 49ers and Saints have the best talent outside if you just take out quarterback in football. And so for New Orleans, the one move, though, I do hate for what they did, they re-signed Andrews Pete, who was a very good offensive guard from 2016 to 2018, one of the best in the league. Last year dropped off in a big way, and it was noticeable. Pull up Pro Football Focus here as their grading system in which they grade individual plays. Pretty much a 55 is considered mediocre. A 65 is considered average-ish, 65, 70, right? A 75, 80 is very good, and like 85, 90 is elite, right? It's out of 100. Pete got a 48.5 last year. He was the only man on that line who was below a 75 grade, and he was well below it. And they gave him 5 years, $55 million with $33 million guaranteed. I think that's a move they could regret. Again, they don't have a lot of cap space to play with. I was really surprised to see them invest that much in that position. For the Panthers, they're just kind of caught in between. You know, I mean, it's very much, you know, I guess to be fair, you're more closer with college football. What do you think Matt Rule's going to want to run down in Carolina? What's he going to try to bring over from Baylor? How's he going to adjust that to the pro style?
I think what Matt Rule is going to do is more of a conventional, pro style offense. Nothing too fancy. You know, they're not going to try to light the scoreboard. And I think especially with Teddy Bridgewater, he's not somebody you probably want throwing on every single down. And especially when you have Christian McCaffrey, you're going to want to diversify a little bit with both your run game and your pass game there. If we go back to the Saints for a bit there, I think, honestly, just to add on to it, I think it's absurd if they think that Taysom Hill – I don't know what the New Orleans Saints are thinking. I think it's absurd if Taysom Hill is their long-term plan at quarterback. What I think is really happening is they're really in a win-now mode. They know that Drew Brees only has a year or two left at best, and I think they really want to try to get one more Super Bowl for Brees and try to put all their eggs in this basket and maybe be willing to rebuild in a year or two, depending on how long Drew Brees decides to play. If it really is his last year, then this is probably their last chance for the next 5 years at a Super Bowl, realistically. And I don't really buy into the notion. I still think Drew Brees is one of the better quarterbacks in the NFL. I wouldn't say he's the best quarterback at this point, but I think he's still, you know, he put up pretty good numbers last year, and he's still very productive. And I mean, he might not be what he's a
top 5 quarterback, though.
I think he's a top 10. I don't know about top 5.
Okay.
But I think if you have a top 10 quarterback, with the other talent that the New Orleans Saints have, I think that's enough to try to win a Super Bowl. I mean, the San Francisco 49ers almost won a Super Bowl with probably one of the worst rated quarterbacks in the NFL last year. New Orleans they don't have obviously as good of a defense. They have Cam Jordan, but they don't have as good of a defense as the Niners do. But I could see them being one of those teams that just kind of ask their quarterback to be the game manager, do a little bit, and just try to win. And I mean, really, the Saints should be set up to win this year, although obviously, as we'll talk about later, they have a bit more competition in their division now.
Yeah, the one thing, though, I like you bringing up the 49ers as a comparison for the Saints, because I think in a lot of ways they match up. Kyle Shanahan and Sean Payton are both offensive geniuses who can get a lot of their talent and make things easy for their quarterback. But that's kind of where I disagree a bit, because the thing about Jimmy Garoppolo, listen, I am no believer in Jimmy Garoppolo. There are moments where I see a guy who, wow, this is going to be a franchise cornerstone, and there are moments where I go, I don't even know if this guy's a starter I can trust in the playoffs. Again, as a 49ers fan, I watched every one of their games last season. I still don't really know what Jimmy Garoppolo is. I think he's probably a borderline top 15, maybe top 10 quarterback in the league. And that's kind of how I see Brees, because the thing is, Garoppolo put up good numbers. It's just he's in Shanahan's system. And, you know, Teddy Bridgewater put up good numbers in Sean Payton's system. Drew Brees did too. My worry with Breeze is it's clear he's no longer the caliber quarterback he was, which, I don't think anyone would argue with me there. But there's a cliff that older quarterbacks fall off of. They fall down, right? And having Bridgewater last year was not only valuable, obviously he was hurt to start the year, but also if last year was when Breeze fell off the cliff, you had Bridgewater there and you could probably have still been competitive. Now, if that happens this season or the season afterwards, what is your plan? And if it is Taysom Hill, I think we're on the same page here, that's not sustainable. As for the Panthers, though, I like all of the moves they're making individually. Like, I think Bridgewater, 3 years, $60 million is a bit higher than I like, but only 1 year is that guaranteed. He's a bridge quarterback. Robbie Anderson, bringing him in at 2 years and $20 million, that's a really good deal for a guy. I know he didn't put up as big numbers with the Jets as people expected, but, I mean, the Jets' offense has been absolute mayhem. He's a talented guy. If he doesn't perform well, you don't have a lot of money invested in it. If he does, then you have a really good receiver on a cheap deal. That's a good trade asset. Trey Boston's another safety they brought in who's good. Interesting thing to note, though, bringing in Anderson probably means Curtis Samuel's available via trade. Third-round pick from a couple seasons ago. I think he's someone a team like the 49ers, a team who's looking for another receiver out there, could be trying to grab for a late-round pick. So I think we're in agreement. The Panthers are the 7th overall pick. They aren't competing for anything next year, right, Mike? I think we're on the same page with that.
Yeah, I think they're either going to be the second to last or the last place team in the division. They'll probably be either them or Atlanta. But
yeah. And the thing is, what's interesting is they are in a pretty good position to tank, because this is the other thing hanging over all of these conversations we have is there's Trevor Lawrence waiting. And Trevor Lawrence is the best quarterback in a prospect of our lifetime since Andrew Luck, arguably the best since Peyton Manning, and maybe even before that.
You also have to consider, too, Trevor Lawrence would probably be a pretty popular pick down there. Clemson's not too far from Charlotte, so that would be obviously something the fans would like. I don't know if they're going to be that bad where, like, Lawrence, barring a major injury or something weird happening, which you never know nowadays, is probably locked in at the number 1 pick next draft. Although we also said that about Tua. Things have changed, obviously. But I don't know if the Panthers are that bad. Like, they're going to have Teddy Bridgewater, who's a serviceable quarterback. I almost guarantee some team in the NFL will have a worse quarterback. If not 5 teams will have a worse quarterback than Teddy Bridgewater.
Yeah, I had the same thought as you. Is I was looking at their offseason moves and going, I like Bridgewater. I like Anderson. I like Boston. I even like Seth Roberts, who they brought in for some depth. They also give them flexibility if they do end up moving on from Samuel. And I'm looking at it going, and obviously, Christian McCaffrey, they have him as a weapon. Obviously, weak offensive and defensive lines, really poor play at cornerback. But I'm looking, I go, they're picking 7 this year, which is a tough place to be because, again, the only quarterbacks you're probably going to be looking at is probably like a Herbert, or really reaching on Easton or Love. That's not something in play for them. So I understand the idea is, get Bridgewater as your bridge, pun intended.
And kind of go off of that, Todd McShay right now, with the Panthers at 7, has them picking Derek Brown, a defensive tackle from Auburn, which would make sense to try to shore up those lines a bit.
Yeah, so obviously I'm 49ers focused. That's where I've been focused mostly on the draft. And, obviously there's a lot of talk that they want a receiver, right? It makes sense. They lost Emmanuel Sanders, as we mentioned, to the Saints. Give another young star to Shanahan to work opposite Deebo Samuel. You obviously have Jerry Jeudy, CeeDee Lamb, and then Henry Ruggs at the top of that. To me, Judy's far and away the best. A fantastic route runner, incredible route runner, and a guy who seems to be ideal for Shanahan's offense. But at 13, with the Raiders and Jets ahead of them, they might have to make some leapfrogs. So I was kind of looking at, let's say the Niners were going to trade up. And again, I don't necessarily think that's likely because they probably want to recoup some other draft assets. The Panthers were a team I actually identified as a good fit because the Niners have 13 and 31. The Panthers have 7. If the Panthers, I don't see anyone who's going to be there at 7 that the Panthers are really dying to get. They're a team that just needs talent to fill out a roster. If the Niners do feel like they want to make a jump for a Jeudy, maybe a tackle falls there that they really target, although, again, I think most likely it'd be a receiver. I think 13 and 31 for, the Panthers' 7th pick, maybe the Panthers throw in a 3rd or 4th rounder to kind of balance that out, makes some sense for the Panthers because I'm kind of with you. They're filling out this roster with a lot of pretty good players and then Christian McCaffrey. But it does kind of they're in the tough spot. They're kind of in no man's land, and you got a relatively new owner, a new coach, a new GM. They kind of seem well set up. If they wanted to tank, and again, if you get Trevor Lawrence, that'd be amazing. But I agree with you. I think they've in some ways done too good a job to be that bad next season. You mentioned the Falcons as the other team at the bottom. What do you think? They lost they basically replaced Devontae Freeman with Todd Gurley. I think that's kind of a wash with a bit of upside. What were you thinking about that move?
I think the Todd Gurley move is a move that has high risk, but could spell big reward for the Falcons. This is a team that was pretty horrific offensively last year. And Devonta Freeman has not been the same as what he used to be. So bringing in Todd Gurley, a Georgia kid, played for the Georgia Bulldogs, could be an interesting move for the Atlanta Falcons. Don't know if it's going to work. We don't really know what if his problems were more injury prone or if it was more that Sean McVay then didn't trust Todd Gurley. Obviously, injuries have played a big role in his career. Question is, can he bounce back from it? I'm not necessarily as prescribed to the belief that running backs are necessarily that short of a shelf life. I think if you give them some rest, they could recover. Obviously, this year's going to be weird with OTAs probably aren't going to happen. Who knows what training camp's going to look like. Maybe that's a good thing for Gurley. Maybe that's a bad thing. I'm not sure how his body operates. But obviously, Gurley has some high upside. Don't really know what his body's like at this point. Another big move was getting Hayden Hurst to replace Austin Hooper. Hayden Hurst was a breakout tight end last year for the Baltimore Ravens with Lamar Jackson and that buzzing offense. That'll be another weapon for Matt Ryan to throw to. They also got Dante Fowler, but they also did give up Desmond Trufant and Vic Beasley on the defensive side. I think with the Falcons, they were pretty bad last year. There's no denying that. And I still
Their
think
defense was atrocious.
Yes. And they still have some good receivers, good weapons at receiver. Obviously, Julio Jones, one of the best receivers of this decade. The question will be, can this offense click? Matt Ryan had a lot of buzz around him when they lost that Super Bowl before they lost that Super Bowl to the Patriots. Ever since then, it's been tough sledding for them. How will this team respond? This was one of their worst years in the last decade, probably. How they respond from that is really the key.
I think again, to me, I'm less questions about the offense. I mean, again, Ryan's getting up there in age. And again, it's starting to get to the point where maybe you think about a quarterback of the future. I don't think they're there yet. They're not, I don't think, they're picking at 16. I don't see them doing anything crazy like picking a Jacob Eason or whatever. They have all their picks in the first 2 days of the draft. They have a pair of fourth rounders as well. But I wouldn't be shocked if they maybe pick a quarterback in those mid rounds. But to me, you got Julio Jones, you got Calvin Ridley. I thought I wouldn't have given up the assets they gave up for Hayden Hurst, but I understand it. He's a good pass catcher. Also, by letting Hooper go and trading for Hurst, they're going to get a compensation pick next year. That might be a third, probably more a fourth round pick. So I understand the temptation to do that. I agree with you on Gurley. I'm a bit skeptical that he can ever be, too large a contributor at the same time. I think Devontae Freeman was a couple years older and seemed to have even more mileage on him. The questions are this defense, because it was just so bad last season. They had some decent interior pressure, obviously built around Grady Jarrett. They had some okay linebacker play. The secondary was just so bad. And that's why releasing Desmond Trufant makes a lot of sense, because he was bad. But they still got to find someone to replace him with. And so I think, the draft, we're going to see a lot of players picked in the secondary. They obviously signed Dante Fowler Jr., who had a good bounce back year after looking like a bust in Jacksonville. He had kind of a resurgent year with the Rams. You obviously know with the Rams, you have Aaron Donald inside. So you might be thinking, well, he had Aaron Donald. How's he going to do here? Well, Grady Jarrett's a pretty good player inside too. And so I think they overpaid a bit, but that's going to help the pass rush. I think he's going to be a upgrade from Vic Beasley, but it's all going to come down to that secondary for me, because I think that offense is going to be good. I think that pass rush is going to be solid enough. If the secondary is solid, I think you're looking at a team. They were already 7-9. I think somewhere in that 7-9 to maybe you get lucky 10-6 range that's fighting for a wild card spot. So
I think also one thing to bring up too with the Falcons, looking at McShay's mock draft here, is currently he has them picking Javon Kinlaw, defensive tackle from South Carolina. But another thing to notice with this part of the draft, Falcons are picking 16th, is that he also has around the same area C.J. Henderson, a quarterback from Florida, Xavier McKinney, a safety from Alabama, Antoine Winfield, a safety from Minnesota. So there's a lot of different options in the secondary too, as well as as well as pass rushers at this like mid to late round range that the Falcons might entertain.
Yeah, I would be, as I say, I understand Kinlaw is a beast. And so I think with McShay, he's looking at, well, if he fell to 16, I understand why Atlanta would consider pulling the trigger. It's just, yeah, I think they need secondary here. I like Henderson. That wouldn't be a bad pick. And again, with draft day trades, who knows how things shake out. Maybe they move up a bit to get a guy they want. Maybe they move down a bit, get some more assets to fill out. Because again, the Falcons are a position where they kind of need defensive depth at secondary. Obviously, you get a stud corner or stud safety. That's fantastic. But they're in a position where they might want to play the numbers a bit, trade down a bit, get some extra pieces. So rather than going in with one corner safety you're pretty confident in, maybe you don't get as good a prospect, but you get 2 or 3 of them to give you a better chance of filling all those holes. So that leaves the Buccaneers. I mean, you're right, the story of the offseason. I don't know whenever the Buccaneers have even been a story other than when they won the Super Bowl with John Gruden after he was traded there from the Raiders. They got Tom Brady.
Yeah, they got Tom Brady.
What do you think of Tom Brady as a player right now, and specifically what it means for Tampa?
I think for Tampa, it's worth it. I mean, you need some kind of injection to your franchise. And even if Tom Brady definitely isn't what he's used to be. He's 42 years old or however old he is. Like, he's not what he used to be. But I think even a marginal Tom Brady is fine for Tampa Bay, honestly. The one thing that I'm kind of curious to see is, obviously the main thing with Brady that is kind of still uncertain was his downfall in production last year because of his lack of targets, or was that because of age, or was that a combination of the two? I think we're about to find out that question, because in Tampa, he's going to have great targets to throw to. Mike Evans, Chris Godwin, who just switched his number to 14, and he's also going to have O.J. Howard, among other weapons. So he's going to have a plethora of weapons to throw to. That's not going to be the problem this year. Now, will he have a strong offensive line? That's kind of to be determined. It's an okay offensive line. It's not the greatest in football, obviously. And Tom Brady is not a mobile quarterback, especially at this age, and he never was, honestly. So really, that's the key, is like, how will Tom Brady mesh with these receivers? And then the other factor that we also mentioned earlier is there's probably going to be no OTAs. Training camp's a question mark. A football season even a question mark. So how will he build this chemistry with receivers, especially going to his first new franchise in his entire career?
It's true. Historically, we've seen plenty of times when a new quarterback gets in, they fly all the receivers out and do their own thing too. He isn't going to, I don't think, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they're all sheltering in place together. I don't think Chris Godwin and Mike Evans and O.J. Howard are there. Obviously, Evans, everyone I think kind of knows is a top receiver in football. Godwin, people don't. Godwin is a stud. Those are two incredible weapons. The one who I was a believer in O.J. Howard coming out of the draft. I was really high on him. I thought he, in a top 10, was worth a pick. He hasn't produced. Now, I think Winston has never really thrown to tight ends. I think that kind of worked against him there, and I think Brady's going to take advantage. But I kind of love this situation from my perspective, because I've been down on Brady. I've been saying that, yeah, he didn't have weapons in New England, but I thought, basically, when they said Tennessee chose Tannehill over Brady, they said the 49ers chose Garoppolo over Brady, I thought those were the right decisions. And I think even Brady, I kind of view a lot like Breeze, where I think he's probably borderline top 10. Probably, I'm more confident to say he's a top 15 quarterback, but I don't know when that cliff is coming. Now, you can come back at me and say, well, maybe he was just done with New England. It seems like there were some legitimate chemistry issues. He might not have been giving it his all last year. He might not want to take some hits before he could go somewhere else to make his name. But there's no more excuses. He's not going to have a great run game, but he's going to have fantastic receivers, a solid offensive line, and an underrated, was underrated. I think pretty soon it's not going to be a really good defense. That defensive line and linebackers, Todd Bowles, I think fired too quickly in New York with the Jets as the head coach, but Bruce Arians took advantage, hired him as defensive coordinator. He's done a fantastic job rebuilding that defense. You got a solid defensive front. And the other thing about that defense, when you look at those numbers, remember Jameis Winston threw 30 interceptions. So, right, think about how many possessions that defense was getting worn out from time of possession and other things because their quarterback was just giving it up constantly.
Yeah, it also helps the Bucs that they were able to re-sign Ndamukong Suh and Jason Pierre-Paul, to bolster that defensive line to ensure that that's good this year. I think the one thing with Brady is I don't really buy into that argument that he didn't care as much last year. If we know one thing about Tom Brady, he's a pretty known competitor. Like, I highly
Mhm.
doubt that was the case in New England. He tried to make it work. Now, the question is, did he have the ingredients to make that recipe work? That's very debatable. The offense looked really good with Antonio Brown early on the season. Legit start. No matter what you think about Antonio Brown, skill-wise, one of the best wideouts this past decade in football. I mean, one thing I saw was that the tallest receiver he's ever thrown to, and like the only one I think above 6'4" or something like that, his entire career is Randy Moss. Mike Evans is like 6'7". This is going to be very interesting because all of a sudden he actually has solid wideouts,
Mhm.
especially Mike Evans. Mike
More than
Evans,
solid. He's got elite.
yes, elite. I mean, Mike Evans has been one of the better wideouts in football over the last however many years, and he hasn't really. I mean, obviously Brady's top targets in New England over the years were Gronk and Julian Edelman and Danny Amendola and guys like that. His shorter slot guys. He didn't really have height receivers. Can he adjust to that? Will that benefit him, especially in his getting into his older age?
Yeah, and the other thing about Tampa, and again, I don't think too much is really going to happen at this point, but it gives them flexibility. In terms of cap space, they also have the most remaining cap space of anyone in this division. They're close to
And I
22
think,
million.
if I can interrupt there, the one thing we're
Go
going
ahead.
to start to see, and has actually been reported, is the Brady effect. A lot of people, I think, are going to look to this opportunity to play with Tom Brady in the twilight of his career. This is a very unique opportunity. You have a proven winner. Whether or not you believe his skills are there, Tom Brady's a legend. And I think there's going to be a lot of people, both on the offensive and the defensive side of the football, that might look at this as a huge opportunity in their career.
Yeah, and so looking ahead, the other good thing on Brady's side, they're picking 14th overall, right? This was a team that was 7-9 last year, so it's not like in these years with New England, most of the time they were working from the back of the first round if they had a pick. This year they're going to get some young talent too. At 14, they're a team. The corners look solid, but safety's a need. And you mentioned McKinney. You mentioned there's some safeties in this draft. I think that's an area they'll need a target. I also think, again, I think their offensive line is solid. There's some good offensive tackles in this draft. If one falls down to them there, I wouldn't be shocked to see them make a move at tackle to give them some insurance policies and also sort of a long-term plan at that position. Sort of in the mid to later rounds, though, running back is still open, right? Peyton Barber's gone, but they've never really had really since I might be missing
They're going to
someone, but I feel
probably
like since,
I think the Tampa might stick with Ronald Jones and see what he can do. That's who their running back's been. But if you look at McShay's draft, and I keep pointing back to this, kind of shows you who's available at that range. Currently, he has been picking Mekhi Becton, an offensive tackle for Louisville.
tackle for Louisville.
But also another offensive tackle you pick in the same range, Andrew Thomas from Georgia. Obviously, you could go for those corners. I personally think the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, knowing that they just invested a lot of money into Tom Brady and are kind of in a win in next 2 years mode,
Yeah.
I think they're going to go offensive tackle to ensure that, especially a non-mobile quarterback like Brady, even though he makes great decisions in the pocket, he's going to take a sack here and there just voluntarily. He's not going to try to evade it. So I think they're going to try to strengthen the offensive line to ensure that he's protected.
Definitely. While Jones had a good close to that season, I still would not be shocked if they take a running back higher than we expect. I don't think they're taking one at 14 or anything, but maybe in the second round, maybe in the third, but definitely in the fourth, fifth, grabbing a running back, especially a running back who's a really good pass catcher, because that's one option. Jones is sort of more your standard, get the ball, run up the middle kind of back. I think get a little scat bat to give Brady, kind of the Dion Lewis, what we saw him do in New England with Brady, I think we're going to see. But Mike, right now, obviously, we still have the draft, still have some other transactions or trades that could surprise us. But looking at this, what's your predictions for these four teams going into next year?
I think personally the Saints are still the favorite. This is a very talent-loaded team. Drew Brees is a proven winner no matter what you think of his production. He's a proven winner in the playoffs. I still see the Saints really 2 years ago, they should have went to the Super Bowl if not for, frankly, a bad call by the referees. So, although Drew Brees might not still be here if they go to that Super Bowl. But I still think the Saints are the favorite. Now, with this new system, it seems like they've gotten rid of the divisions and it's all about seeding. I think the Buccaneers actually might be a playoff favorite. Now, they're going to be on the lower end, probably a 6th or a 7th seed in the NFC. But I actually think the Buccaneers do have a playoff run in them this year.
Yeah, I gotta admit, I want to root against Brady. I've been the low person on Brady the past 3 years. I want to be the low person again. But I think this is a fantastic fit. I really like Bruce Arians as a coach. I said I really like that defense. This isn't about Brady. This is about the team they've built and built a situation where a guy like Brady can step in. If it was Breeze, honestly, if they got Bridgewater, I'd be here too. Although Bridgewater would be a weird fit with Arians' offense. But I think you're right. They're probably a team. Again, the Falcons, I'm not very confident in them being a team that makes the playoffs, but I think they're a team that people might underrate because the Buccaneers are going to get all the coverage. People are going to be confident in the Saints. And again, I do still think, while the Saints are obviously the favorite, no longer having Teddy Bridgewater, unless they get something changes here in the next, few weeks or months, if they don't have a good insurance policy for Drew Brees and he goes down, I think that division could be wide open. And I mean, obviously we're in agreement. I think the Panthers will be probably back around that 5-11 to 7-9 range, barring anything dramatic. I think they're going to sort of be picking right where they are next year, hopefully trying to add some talent through the draft though.
Yeah, and I think the one thing that will be interesting to see is, this doesn't really have to do with records, but is the public perception of Tom Brady. For the last few years, he's kind of been a villain in a way, because for a lot of reasons, mainly because of how much that he's won in New England. Going to Tampa Bay, a team that hasn't had as much success, like me personally, I don't feel as compelled to hate Tom Brady as I once did with the New England Patriots. Like, I think that might be a thought process that a lot of people go through. Maybe it was more the collective of the Patriots that, like with Belichick, Brady, and everything that goes on in that organization, that people really didn't like, in comparison to actually not liking Tom Brady himself. That's going to be a very interesting development that we don't really know how it's going to play out yet. And the other thing we should note is, we don't even know if there's going to be a football season. Like, there's a very real possibility football doesn't even happen this year. I still find that to be unlikely. I think there's a very high chance there's going to be no fans in the stadium. Kind of depends, obviously, how this crisis develops. But we don't know what this calendar is going to look like. All we really know is there's going to be a virtual draft in late April, and that's about it at this point.
And the one thing that's interesting about that, I hadn't really thought of this, but let's say the season gets shortened. Let's say it goes to 12 games or 14 games. That benefits teams with older players, players with experience, because there's less hits, so less chance of injury, and younger guys have less practice and game reps to improve. And so that's, an interesting point for a guy like Brady. And to be fair, my criticism of the Saints, and for a guy like Breeze, that actually could benefit the teams that are more reliant on older talent. Again, especially the Saints. It's not just Breeze, Daniel Sanders, and Jenkins.
This also could hurt Tom Brady, though, because if it's a shortened season, this might be less time to grow through the growing pains of learning a new team. Nobody knows, and that's the problem. Like, nobody knows, so you can't plan right now. I mean, there might be a chance that in July, we might be at a point where we might still somewhat be isolating, but maybe the receivers and Brady could meet up for an off-season workout like a lot of quarterbacks normally do. That might be a possibility in July. Who knows? But stuff like that is really only time will tell at this point.
Yeah, and it'll be – I'm really excited to see, because I love Bruce Arians and his offensive coordinator, Byron Leftwich, and what they do offensively. But it's not really what Brady's done in New England. So I'm curious to see, does Brady come in there and do what he wants and they just let that happen? Or did he choose them because he also likes what they do? And maybe we see some new things that tap into something we haven't seen from Brady. Well, Mike, we wanted to keep this to 30 minutes. As with us, we often talk a bit more than we probably plan to. But I think it's a good episode. We'll be back. We're going to continue going through the different divisions in the NFL, running this through before the draft, but we're also going to talk about all the other latest top stories. We'll get to the WNBA draft, talk about the NFL draft when that gets closer. Obviously, NBA draft, we'll see. But, sort of all these things. This is the Marc and Mike Show. I'm Marc DeLucchi. That's Michael Lee. Follow us on SoundCloud and the YouTube channel. You can follow us individually on our social medias as well.
Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe in this video or on the SoundCloud. If you have any recommendations for what you want us to talk about, please leave a comment, or you can message us right away. We'd be happy to possibly entertain those ideas, and keep listening. Thank you all for listening.